In this video, we will be discussing Chapter 15, Economics, Fiscal Policy. Fiscal policy is one of the biggest tools to understand when it comes to macroeconomics. Fiscal policy, and then in the next chapter, we'll talk about monetary policy. So let's jump right into what is fiscal policy. In Section 1, we're going to understand what are the goals and limitations to fiscal policy and understand, again, what it is. How does it work? So the simple definition that we find for this is that it's when the government is spending and revenue collection to influence the economy. So whenever the government decides to spend or expand their spending, that would be considered fiscal policy. Whenever they collect taxes, if they increase tax or decrease tax, that is also fiscal policy. So it is a enormous tool that is used to help influence the economy to help it continue to grow. So the purpose of it is to expand or, if needed, to slow down economic growth. So if we're finding inflation is going too high too quickly, we would then want to have the government to slow down the economy. If we're heading to recession, we'd want to flip that and have it on the other end where the government intervenes to increase spending and decrease taxes in order to increase fiscal policy. So one of the biggest ways they do this is by creating a federal budget. So each really 15 to 18 months out, a federal budget committee gets together and the government has its agencies that get together and decide on how much they need to have in their budget for the next fiscal year. And this ginormous document is known as the federal budget. It is an actual written document that's out there that politicians need to read through it before they decide if they're going to vote through this revenue or not. In this chapter, we will have an opportunity to pass a class budget, a class party budget, but it has to come down to all of the House and Senate members agreeing upon the budget, which will be each and every one of you. Now, the fiscal policy, when we think fiscal year, typically we think January through December. And most organizations run that way, January through December. Like the school, though, is different. Our fiscal year is July 1st to the last day of June. And with the government, their fiscal year is October 1st to September 30th. So what does that actually mean? What that means is that the budget that has been passed for that year, all that money needs to be spent by the last day of that fiscal year. Or if the money is spent too quickly and not enough money is able to make it to the end of the year, technically, by budget, they're supposed to stop spending, which unfortunately we do not do. So October 1st to September 30th is the fiscal year of the federal budget. This document that you see here, you will need to understand how the federal budget process works. You will see this on the Chapter 15 and 16 test that will be coming later, but you will need to understand this entire process when it comes to understanding how the federal budget is actually passed. So I will provide this document for you on Schoology in order for you to use it as a study guide. But here is just the federal budget, how it's passed in a nutshell. So the president has different agencies that he is responsible for. So he has all these different secretaries that are underneath him, and they have departments, and their job is to come up with a budget they need each year. So the FBI, the CIA, the Federal Budget Committee, the park system, urban development, commerce, all of these different departments have to put together a budget, and then they give their budget to an organization called the OMB. It's known as the Office of Management and Budget. And then what they do is they get all of these budget proposals together, revise them to what they think they should be, and then they put it into a proposal. Then the OMB gives it to the president looks at it, puts OK on it, and then he gives it to Congress. Now this is where if the president And the House and the Senate are on different parties, meaning if you have one Democrat side for the House and if you have a Republican president, it's going to be very difficult usually to pass a budget. So the president submits his idea of what he thinks a good budget would be for that year. Then it goes to, once it enters into Congress, then the work begins and the budget is given to the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. And their job is to look through and look to see, okay, what exactly are they asking for in these budgets to be covered? So they talk about estimates and details of what they think it would be. So the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee are very powerful because they kind of get to decide on what gets into the actual budget. Then from there, if it passes that committee, then it goes to a subcommittee and also the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee. The House Appropriation and the Senate Committee are probably the most powerful committee throughout all of them. And the reason why is because they decide on how much money can be allocated or budgeted for the government's proposal. So the director of the FBI has to go in front of the House Appropriation and the Senate Appropriation Committees and has to say, I need this $80 million for this next year, and here's my reasoning why. And the members of this committee have to question and ask, okay, you want 80 million? Explain it in detail. You had 78 million last year. Why do you need $2 million more? Or whatever it might be. If it passes those committees, then it's flipped, and then it goes to the House bill, goes to the Senate, and the Senate goes to the House. And then they have a conference committee, which is both appropriations committees coming together to decide if this has a chance of surviving. And then the final proposal is sent to the House and Senate. If it passes that, then it goes to the president's desk. Now, if the president doesn't like it, he can actually veto it, and then as a result, the process starts all over again, or the House and Senate can pass it with 2/3 majority. Now, what happens if they get to September 30th and a new budget bill has not been passed? Well, there's something known as stopgap funding. This is where it's like an emergency fund that is put into place to continue to have the government open for weeks. Weeks usually is what we see. And what happens when they get to the end of the funding for the stopgap funding? Well, then that's what we see, a government shutdown. And we've seen these, unfortunately, quite often over the last few years. And again, it's because the House and Senate and the President do not all get along. So that's just in a nutshell on what that looks like for passing a budget. All right, next slide here. Now, I already mentioned the word appropriations. Appropriation committee is what we saw. Appropriation bills go to the appropriation committee and they decide on how much a specific amount of spending can be presented to the government, on how much they think is realistic. And stopgap funding, same thing. If they do not meet that September 30th deadline, they have to pass stopgap funding bill. And like I said, emergency fund, trying to keep the government running. Now, there's a couple of different policies that exist when it comes to the idea of fiscal policy. One is expansionary, and this is where we see increased spending or tax cuts. So if the economy is heading towards a recession, we will have an expansionary policy that is passed. This means the government will increase spending, which means more products and services will be demanded, which will result in more jobs needed, and also tax cuts, meaning that less taxes, meaning more money in people's pockets, consumers' pockets, which means they can go out and spend more. So whenever you're heading towards a recession, expansion policy is what you need. On the flip side, if it's a contractionary policy, this is mean the government's going to slow down spending or raise taxes. And this is results when we have high inflation. So let's say if we're at a regular 4% inflation rate each year, and this next year it goes 12% inflation rate, well, that means products and services have too high of a selling price on them, which means that we're in a very high inflation. So what the government can do is slow down spending, which means now demand is going to slow down. They can raise taxes, which means now everyone has less money available to them, which is going to make inflation drop naturally. So contractionary policy, other one. Now, in order to have a successful fiscal policy, it is very difficult to do. One, you have to have appropriations committee that are having the correct spending levels. But if we have a disaster that takes place, or several disasters that take place in the same time, then the spending limit has to be changed. Also, it's trying to put a document together based on what they think is going to happen over the next 18 months or 12 months for the year, predicting the future. And that's very, very difficult to do. So finding a way to try to use fiscal policy properly is difficult to do. And then we have limits on fiscal policy. We have delayed results. If it's taking 18 months to get this document put into place and finished, well, it's going to be delayed results. It's going to take a long time. And then there's political pressure. Nobody wants to cut the budget for their committee, for their department, or whatever it might be, because if they cut money for that, well, then they're not going to get the money next year for it. So there's political pressure from both major parties, Republicans, Democrats, lots of pressure there. And then just coordination of the fiscal policy, working together. It's hard enough to try to get a budget that's happy with everyone, but then getting a president and a House and a Senate to all work together to pass a fiscal policy is very difficult to do. So there is some serious limitations when it comes to fiscal policy. And that is the end of Section 1, Chapter 15, Fiscal Policy.